Education is preparation for reparations.
I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Gail Bradbrook, who's going to be speaking to us about the new abolitionism and its catalysing of the People's Reparations International movement.
Thank you very much. It's almost 5 years that Extinction Rebellion declared rebellion against the UK government outside here in Parliament Square. And of course we've not succeeded in our aims, and I now know, and the key to why I'm here speaking with you today, is that the primary reason we have failed, along with the rest of the global North environmental movement, is our innate belief that the global North will save the world. In fact, the learned feeling that we are the saviours after all, and so to address the crises we are in, we can simply pressurise global North governments to better policies, that this is the only viable route for global change. It's this Eurocentricity that's currently turning a blind eye to the amazing climate leadership in Colombia under the Petro Marquez government. Their work and statements go largely unrecognised in our Eurocentric environmental movements, when we should be shouting their leadership from the rooftops. But of course, such shouting would be to begin placing us no longer on top of the pyramid, but among our global family, something that seems so obvious, and yet the whiteness we're trained into fights tooth and nail to stay at the centre of the story. Personally, I have learned this as part of building the XR Being the Change affinity network, alongside my majority world colleagues such as Esther and Kobina, who spoke earlier, and others such as Skeena Rathor and Kofi Mowgli-Kloo. Joining this family has been, and of course still is, a huge challenge to my own learned Eurocentricity. And we've created XR Being the Change affinity network to bring others on this action learning journey. A journey that clearly names the crisis not simply as the climate and ecological crises, but more truthfully as the rapacious, white supremacist global political economy. It's a cannibalistic imperial system that's the root cause of the collapse that we're in.
True. Yes. Thank you.
A collapse that is social, economic, political, and is starting to be felt even here at the heart of empire in the so-called cost of living crisis, and that 40,000 people here die in so-called excess deaths recently. We name loudly that it is this diseased culture of stress and fear that has long been a breeding ground for authoritarian divide and rule responses whenever challenged. Global North tactics to maintain the status quo take place in the form of embargoes, in the supply side, a provision of corruption services that the City of London is at the heart of globally, and the destabilised of local industry, and the direct murder of progressive leaders across the global south. Notably this year, it is 50 years since the West instigated a coup in Chile, and 70 years since the coup in Iran, with countless interventions in between and since. As we've learned, the West especially seeks to overthrow those who would choose to use their own natural resources for the benefit of their own people. Gaddafi would be a significant African example of that, and the suffering of Libyan people right now, with the impacts of climate change, can be linked directly to the chaos in the country created by the West.
True.
And in this, I name our Eurocentric movements as directly complicit.
Yes.
For even in my own movement, Extinction Rebellion, the current major uprisings that we've been hearing about today in the Sahel are largely unseen and ignored. A white supremacist attitude that sadly is reflected internally in the attempted dismantling of our XR internationalist solidarity networks, except we're not going to accept that. The only group in XR UK who have attempted to build bridges between such movements and ourselves. I say we are complicit because we know that this blindness has long allowed the imperial eradication of global South progressive forces without any mass challenge in the West. And unless we change our ways, we will soon see our hands bloody as the West attempts to reassert its domination again. This is the disconnection in the global family that we here are raised into and asked to continue. A self-congratulatory story that means even in the face of structural oppression and climate meltdown, there is little momentum behind seeking to create peoples-to-peoples unity. This very unity that is essential if here in the global north we're to avoid a descent into eco-fascism and a descent that those in power are already paving the way for. Without addressing this disconnection head-on and instead continuing these fruitless attempts to convince power to change, the movement in the global north will not just be ineffective, but will be in fact directly enabling this rising authoritarianism and eco-fascism. So we understand that new abolitionists are people that overstand this division across our human family. We know the historic roots of this division and how it is actively maintained in the present. We understand that the systems of domination are extractive, live around us, live within us and between us, and we cannot face together the multiple catastrophes without first centering the repair of these divisions. New abolitionists understand that this is the true meaning of reparations and that only through uniting can we build a repaired world. And of course we know this begins with backing the continued resistance of our global South family and their communities of resistance in their intergenerational fight for life. We know that they are our best allies in saving what we can of the Earth's life support system, because that's where the majority of the extraction of the fossil fuels, etc., are taking place. We know that to join them here in the global north, we have to build economies of deep growth, relearn common in and cooperation, and struggle to provision for ourselves with high-quality, universal basic services, so that this story of divide and rule, where it's, money's to be handed over and we haven't got enough money here, we sweep that inside in favour of universal basic services here that we provide for ourselves in solidarity with the needs met of our family across the world. This also means fighting fascist tendencies in our communities, reclaiming our stories of resistance, and that it means working for self-sufficiency, as we can no longer live off the oppression of our global family. New abolitionists are people who recognise these needs, and the only chance we have of achieving this is through our siblings uprising in the global south, that as they take back their land and resources, as is happening in Niger at the moment, that as they repudiate odious debts and create a multipolar world, they break the Eurocentric lies of disconnection and superiority. Before I hand on to my young colleague, Robin, wrong side of 30 actually, to elucidate the practical work we're already doing, I want to finish by centering this word whiteness, not as it wishes to be centred, but as it truly is, as a pathology. In XRBCAN, we use the term Wetiko whiteness, Wetiko being a cross-indigenous peoples term of the northeast of so-called North America, and the Dogon term Urugu, to name the insatiable greed that's at the heart of whiteness. A greed and emptiness that is a potential within all of us, a potential realised when our fear of not being enough, of not having enough, overshadows our ability for collaboration and love. We name this as whiteness because the white culture that elite Europeans birthed contained no ancestrally wise stories, such as Wetiko or Urugu, to warn us against this tendency. We may see, though, that the elites actually are represented now in our cultures as vampires, and that our numbness as people racialised as white, you might think of as these stories of zombies. So it's a culture, no, it's a pathology that celebrates this cannibalistic and self-centred overconsumption. So as such, our use of the word whiteness both describes the systems of racialised oppression around us and within us, and directly challenges those of us who are racialised as white to come out of these states of disassociation, denial and disconnection. These states induced by numbing imperial comforts and unacknowledged privileges that hide our true identity as human beings and responsibilities as part of a human family. This reawakening that our colleague Skeena Rathore names as co-liberation asks us to notice and recover our humanity through practices of what Resmaa Menakem has called somatic abolitionism, practices of the body to be felt within the body and liberated within the body. As co-liberators, we're asked to stop ignoring the white supremacist dynamics playing out across the world and within our movement. Some of us call it white glazing, the glazing over when we are at the centre of the story. As new abolitionists, we're tasked to think about our individuality to the systemic, and thus to lift the bonnet even on the depravity at the heart of the story of how we even became to be white. To remember the trauma and the harm that the elites visited upon us before they enslaved our family. To remember the witch burnings and the enclosures, the vagrancy brandings, and how they murdered our resistance fighters. We must remember because we have been made to forget. And in our forgetting, we have normalised the role they have forced us to play in their paradigm of domination. We lost our ways, our stories, our her stories and his stories, and in such lostness, we lose our very selves, our humanity, are dismembered, as we are infected with this viral sickness of Wetiko whiteness and tasked to enforce this barbarity. And yet, called into our humanity by our global family, we do remember. We remember the Rebecca riots. We remember Ket's rebellion. We remember the Stroudwater riots in my own town. And we remember when, united with the uprisings of our global family, we moved en masse to abolish the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans. We remember, and in these beginnings of our repaired dignity and sovereignty as Europeans, beyond the pathology of whiteness, we as new abolitionists look to take our first steps as part of the People's Reparatory International Movement and towards planet repairs. Thank you.
Education is preparation for reparations.